Hello and welcome to Audiovisual Cultures with me, Paula Blair. This is a live spare recording. Just to explain some context, I have been hustling for a good couple of months to try to get some more guests on the show. We've had a really lovely run over the past few months, having lots of guests from all over the world, and it's been so lovely to have such a range of people, and I was trying to continue to do that, and I've had lots of experiences where people have been really keen and said yes, but they need a bit of time, and that's completely fair enough. And then I just haven't really heard back yet, and they still might get back to me. People are busy. It's a very stressful time in the world. So we'll just, hopefully in the next few months, we will get some people on that I have invited. For now, just in case I run out of episodes again, what I decided to do, because I haven't really wanted to do this, because it feels very self-indulgent. In the past, when I've needed an episode, I've read something of mine that's been published before, but they're usually paywalled. So I like to try and put them out there if I can. And what I thought I would do is, it's maybe an interesting time. I don't know how else to put it. And interesting seems a bit flat a thing to say, but 6.5 years ago, this was published. This is my monograph from my PhD thesis, and what I thought I would do would be, I think this was an idea Andrew, my partner, had a while ago, was read it. I suppose a bit like a partial audiobook every time. Would just be reading bits of it and then communicate with it, so have a conversation with it, and I guess my younger self, because things have moved on so much. So the title of it, because I showed you but I didn't actually tell you, it's Old Borders, New Technologies, Reframing Film and Visual Culture in Contemporary Northern Ireland. So this is my PhD thesis, which finished in 2011. The book was published in 2014. It's 2020, things have moved on a little bit since then. So something that was so immediate already feels really out of date. I'm really out of the loop with stuff, but I thought, just as spare recordings, people may never hear them, but I thought I would do this live on Instagram just so that somebody then can see them every now and again, so they'll be there as a bit of an archive of what I'm up to and some background on what it's like doing the podcast and stuff. So if anybody happens to join in and see this, hello. If you want to interact, that's great. But before I start all that, I want to say a big hello and thank you to members on patreon.com/avcultures. Your support is so valued, and I don't have many of you, but the ones I have of you, I love you so much. You're awesome. I appreciate so much that you find value in what I do and that you're supporting it. For anybody who wants to support and feels that they can't do that monetarily, your shares and your likes on social media and just word of mouth and suggesting it to people. If you know anyone who wants to be on a podcast, and if they have anything that's something to do with audiovisual cultures, put them my way as well. I mean, that in itself is a big help. You yourselves, if you see this, if you feel like you have something you'd like to say through this platform, just get in touch and have a chat with me. So there's Patreon support, and when we wrap up, this is also why I wanted to do this on Instagram Live, was that it gives you that hour of a time frame so that I wouldn't blather on all day at you. And so when I get the 2-minute warning, I'm going to do the wind up, I'm going to do the closing. So I'll give you a few more options if you would like to support, but you don't want to do that through Patreon. We're on Instagram as AV Cultures Pod, but we're also on Twitter as AV Cultures and Facebook as AV Cultures. If you search for Audiovisual Cultures, you should find it. And there's the website as well if you want some more information. I thought I would give this a go. It's a bit of an experiment. We'll see how it is. And I suppose it's just nice practice to practice speaking and reading and getting the brain working again. But here we go. So let's see, how should we do this? If I position it like that, you should be able to see it. And just to point out, on the photograph on the front cover was taken by my friend Jordan Hutchins, who is a really amazing photographer, and he specialises in live performance art. And what you're seeing on the front cover here was taken in September 2013 on Culture Night Belfast. artist, and this is Andre Stitt during AAA's Memorandum performance, and I talk about that performance quite a bit in the opening of the introduction of the book. And just in the out of focus area in the background here is Elvira Santa Maria Torres, who has featured on the podcast as well. She's there as a viewer of this. This was in Catalyst Arts back then, so just if you were wondering what the image is. So I'm going to start with the preface, which is a rejig of my PhD thesis abstracts. The convergence of film and visual art practices in contemporary Northern Ireland reflects its complex network of contested spaces. Its visual culture is being radically reshaped in the wake of the Troubles and is increasingly open to globally employed artistic influences and methods. These factors challenge the expressive and social capability of traditional filmic practices to engage with the complexities of a post-conflict society, such as imprisonment, testimony, social control, changing landscapes, memory and trauma. Filmmakers using more traditional modes of storytelling tend to gloss over the deeper psychological concerns emerging in society in favour of narrative and dramatic formulas. This book presents an expanded perception of moving image production in order to consult work showing in alternative spaces of reception, using experimental approaches that endeavour to engage more effectively with the social complexities of the Northern Irish context. The research hybridises the language of (Irish) film theory with those of new media, expanded cinema and digital arts, categories of converging art forms that are becoming increasingly institutionalised, and explores questions such as the following. How successful are these film and visual artworks in subverting the ideology of mass media representations of the conflict? Do such works effectively disrupt canon formation within the context of contemporary Northern Irish film and visual art? Does a broader context for Northern Irish film and visual culture allow for greater inclusion of women artists? In addressing such questions, the project is structured around 4 conflict-related themes of imprisonment, surveillance, traumatic recall and storytelling. Through this thematic approach that draws on global shifts in film and visual arts practices, the project aims to move towards a discussion of the notion that the Troubles was a mediatised conflict. In doing so, it presents an argument for compiling a history of the conflict as a media-managed construct that has led to very real suffering, the legacy of which must be addressed through alternative modes of media and performance-related education. This text does not claim to be comprehensive, but rather attempts to be part of a larger conversation concerning film and visual cultures in post-conflict societies more generally. So I suppose just a word on that was I never wanted to write a survey. I never wanted to write a chronological history of things. Those already existed in abundance, and I think they were very selective, and things are very male and of course white, and possibly very focused on the able. I think at this point I brought in that disclaimer that was probably not in the original thesis, but it was just more, these are a set of studies, because really when I was doing the thesis, what were my chapters? They're too big for chapters. They were these 4 studies, and they were each the size of a master's dissertation. And they were all connected, they're all interlinked, and they build upon one another. So they're quite big chapters that are broken into sections for study. There's a lot of cross connections across them, but also there are a lot of connections internationally, historically, and I think that was where, at this point in my ongoing research, a few years on, I was already expanding outward into the rest of the world and looking at the plurality of, well, there are different ways of being post-conflict or post-dictatorship, and there are different ways of being post-anything, and are you even really post when it's not really resolved? So I was already still asking those questions and exploring them And so I just really wanted to be clear in a bit of the book that probably no one ever reads, that these are pluralities. These are things that affect people at different times in different ways all over the world. And this was about a specific moment, but it was a specific moment that could speak backwards and forwards to other cultures, to other societies, to other modes of practice, to other practitioners, so on and so forth. So I think that was really the project I was beginning. So after the preface is the acknowledgements, and there's a lot going on there. I don't think I'm going to read this. If you request it, I will, but a lot of it's very personal. There's a lot of names here that conjure up painful as well as happy memories. There's also, I'm sorry to say, names in there that I can't remember who the people are. It's terrible. It's nothing personal. It's just I became ill since this and I cannot remember certain names and who they belong to. So anyway, we're going to skip ahead. There are also several pages if you're interested of acronyms, just explaining what all the acronyms are, because if you're talking about the Northern Ireland conflict, there's going to be a lot of acronyms, so they're just explaining what all those are. So the introduction, converging boundaries, and we begin with a quotation in the epigraph from Kim Levin in Irish Art Now, published in 1999, and I quote, "The modern world of fixed borders no longer exists, having dissolved along with the old belief in universality. The recent obsession of many artists and curators around the world with issues of migration and uprootedness, and the equal, if opposite, fixation on the specifics of cultural identity do not simply relate to personal, cultural and national histories and current events. These concerns also emit from a profound state of displacement that is less external than internal, less geographical than temporal, less historical than epochal. Consciously or unconsciously, willingly or unwillingly, artists articulate the traumas of a time as well as a place." Unquote. On 20 September 2013, 3 veteran artists culminated a durational performance which had lasted for a total of 10 hours, split over 5 evenings. The final show happened during Culture Night Belfast, an event for which tens of thousands of people descend on Northern Ireland's capital to experience it at its most vibrant. Just as an aside there, times have changed a bit. I mean, we're in 2020, so Culture Night Belfast is, I hear, going to be fully online this year because of pandemic reasons. But this was a time when Culture Night was my absolute favourite night of the year. It was amazing. And I think that year was the last time I was ever there for it, because the year after that I moved to Newcastle, so I've never been able to go to Culture Night again because I've been living and working in England since then. It has changed hands, it's changed leadership, it's changed direction and all sorts, but I think it still looks amazing every year, and its online collection looks pretty cool this year as well. So if this recording ever gets used for the podcast, then it'll have long passed probably, but it's just something that's worth looking into. I have very special memories of Culture Night from across many years since it began. It means a lot to me, so this was a really special evening as well in particular, I think. I have a lot of really lovely memories from this. I continue. When I had seen many of the diverse delights on offer, I took the familiar trek through my native city from the Cathedral Quarter, which has become Belfast's artistic and cultural centre, towards a dark alleyway lined with graffiti and street art, in which the artist-run gallery Catalyst Arts is situated. So now I have to break out again, because the Cathedral Quarter, I think it has been the beating heart of culture in the city for a good few years now, and it is again this year, and very, very recently this news has broken. So I'm recording this in September 2020, and the Cathedral Quarter has largely been sold off to private developers who have nothing to do with the region at all, and it just seems like it's going to be homogenous office spaces, retail spaces and high-rise flats and stuff, and it's just going to lose a lot of really amazing, beautiful buildings, and it's going to change a lot. And it just feels that cultural areas and cultural hub areas, I don't really know how else to put it, but they're under constant attack no matter where you are. And keeps getting the backing of politicians who no one's really sure how they keep getting in power, because no one seems to really like them, and yet they're always in power. So it's all a bit confusing, really. But there we are. So it's very sad and it's very angering. But this place means something to an awful lot of people, and it comes up a lot in my research. It's not going to be the last time you'll hear this area, the Cathedral Quarter, being mentioned. It comes up a lot in my other work as well. Okay. The view that met me upon my arrival is one that I will continue processing for some time to come. The substantial space inside the gallery was consumed by the materials and debris of what had transgressed there throughout the previous 4 evenings. And I realised as I examined the overwhelming amount of visual material of every imaginable kind in the space, that for every sight, sound and action going on around me captured the precise moment of life in contemporary Northern Ireland. Such was the scale of the materiality of the live event, any viewers could not help but interact with it in some way. The floor was covered in copious amounts of shredded paper imprinted with text. It was difficult to read them, however, as they had been trampled on, soaked with water, and you never knew when one of the shopping trolleys that the artists had acquired would be flung violently in your direction next. The walls were lined at about shoulder height with facsimiles of newspaper clippings detailing the most harrowing stories from the span of the civil conflict, known colloquially as the Troubles, that has happened in this place. They were hung askew so that the viewers who chose to look at them had to change their position physically to adjust their vision. The materials in the space were many and included bikes with red and blue streamers atop a tall ladder, a glass case containing more shredded paper, an overturned chair, discarded clothes and text clippings of people's testimonies stuck to the glass, a mound of foliage into which André Stitt had inserted a black flag, making it resemble the July bonfires, shopping trolleys containing an array of props, including a platinum blonde wig, and the delayed feed from a live recording camera projected onto one of the walls, as well as several prepared audiovisual projects appearing on the walls throughout the space and filling the busy soundscape. This is before even mentioning the 3 artists who were interacting with these materials and each other, namely André Stitt, Alistair MacLennan and Adrian Hall, who combined as the collective AAA. During the 5 evenings they spent working in the space, they each performed singularly in their own ways and often crossed paths or organically came together. Hall implemented his practice of live work, which on the final night involved donning heavy overalls and noisily performing tasks of construction, destruction in the space, as well as providing some dark humour by speaking nonsense in a comical voice and waltzing with a white dress. MacLennan engaged in his trademark actuations, which is his term for performance installations, and are largely informed by Zen Buddhism. Although he was the calmest of the 3, he joined in their vocalizations of tension and engaged the spectators in small moments of participation. He used a megaphone for some time to list a range of verbs such as admitting, praying, being, and so on, and handed out paper planes, which most of the spectators threw back into the space. On mine is a photocopied image of a shopping trolley full of dolls dressed as judges, clearly making a comment about how justice can be bought and sold. MacLennan and Hall's performances were an unforgettable experience, but the night belonged to Stitt, whose affecting actions were a scathing rebuttal of the pointless violence in society and the abuse of children, particularly at the hands of the church. Garbed in the blacks and dog collar of the clergy, Stitt stomped around aggressively, shouting at intervals, including repeatedly yelling "Hokey cokey" into the megaphone for a time, which was echoed by Hall shouting "Hokey cokey okie dokie" in a comical tone. He also threw talcum powder everywhere, cut his trouser legs so that they gathered round his ankles, and walked around or stood still while staring into space with sad affection as he held onto a range of white shirts that became progressively smaller until reaching a baby-sized vest. At one point, he held this vest to McLennan's back in a comforting and caring way for several minutes as McLennan balanced on his head. I've just seen a typo, that's not okay. How did I miss that one? At one point, he held this vest to McLennan's back in a comforting and caring way for several minutes as McLennan balanced on his head along tree branches from which black balloons wearing black balaclavas were strung. Finally, Stitt, who often employs degrees of self-mutilation in his live work, carved the letters Northern Ireland into his forearm, and you can just about see that on the front cover there of the book if you're seeing the video. This action encapsulated the unnecessary violence and bloodshed in the name of a conflict which has officially ended but has still not been resolved in community levels. The letters also represent a phonetic play on the region's name, Northern Ireland, which demonstrates the incongruity of the violence against the population's otherwise self-deprecating and wry sense of humour. This powerful collective work, entitled Memoranda, evoked many of the problems in Northern Ireland's contemporary socio-political climate, while demonstrating the vibrancy and challenging nature of the region's much overlooked film and visual culture that directly intersects with those concerns. This text introduces and critically engages with that culture. So the next section is titled Film and Visual Culture in Contemporary Northern Ireland. This study describes, analyses and expands contemporary notions of film and visual culture at a time when there is still little consensus about what it is to be Northern Irish, or indeed a Northern Irish filmmaker, artist or artwork. This discussion does not become directly involved in arguments concerning national identity, genre or categorisation, nor does it rigorously historicise film and visual art practices. Instead, it reconsiders traditional formulations of national cinema and artistic canons by discussing key themes which have emerged simultaneously across moving image production. It interrogates narrow identitarian discourses by analysing works that are specific to Northern Ireland, works that are also relevant beyond its borders in their forms and meanings. 4 discourses frame the research, and each draws connected themes from the different methods employed by practitioners. These methods are contributing to a diverse visual culture that is both specific to home while also capable of stitching seamlessly into those abroad. Subordinating a distinctive history of Northern Irish film and visual art to a more conceptual approach also facilitates a more direct and urgent engagement with mixed media forms and their relationship to new technologies as they have developed. The inclusion of certain works in the study is therefore not necessarily motivated by the need to establish a historical, categorical compilation. It is not an index or chronology of work within a set time period, but rather a series of explorations into different modes of film and visual art practice that converge with each other, as well as a society now emerging from conflict and a larger world facing those same issues. Stemming from the undefined, indefinable nature of Irish art, artist and scholar Justin McKeown promotes the efficacy of assessing the relationship between artwork at home and abroad, rather than attempting to form a canon, quote, so that the work produced in Northern Ireland can be understood in relation to wider cultural production on the planet, unquote. While this study aims to begin such an undertaking, it is not enough to simply draw upon similarities between practices and cultures. The discussed work ought to incorporate and contribute meaningfully to sociological and aesthetic discussions. For decades, the conflict in Northern Ireland has proved to be the elephant in the room for British and Irish politics, which is alluded to in the title of Alan Clark's short drama Elephant, released in 1989. Commissioned for the BBC, produced by Danny Boyle and filmed largely in Belfast, the short non-narrative film was originally one of 4 standalone dramas about the Troubles. Its 18 repetitive segments contain minimal, if any, dialogue and offer no explanations for the series of murders which it depicts. The long takes filmed with a Steadicam show fragments of walking action which all culminate in shootings. The lengthy sequences represent the quotidian nature, banality even, of sectarian killings at the height of the conflict, all of which is played out against a backdrop of an unidentifiable, placeless urban centre that is devoid of recognisable landmarks. In Elephant, the sides of the conflict are indeterminable, and the perpetrator-victim identities are problematised by the film's interchanging dynamics. In short, rhythmic sequences tend to follow one or two men as they walk at a steady pace. A pattern emerges where the camera is following the perpetrator of each act of murder and rests on the dead victim or a view of the crime scene. This pattern is disrupted by later sequences that follow the victim, but of course the viewer is initially tricked into labelling each followed figure on screen as we come to associate the repetitive scenario with one side of the victim-perpetrator binary and not the other. Clarke's film collapses that binary and in doing so encourages the spectator to consider how easily led we are by such methods of communication in the media. It also demarcates the slippery nature of the terms perpetrator and victim, particularly in a civil conflict. There is no indication of why each victim is targeted, whether the killings are paramilitary, motivated by revenge, or are random acts of violence. Elephant depicts a world of violence dominated by men, which, as Jim Smith points out, is a noticeable trend throughout the conflict and its representation in art and literature. Also, all 18 shootings appear to take place in working class areas, meaning that this violence is specifically associated with working class men. Due to the importance of its commentary as well as its form, Elephant continues to provide a contentious example of filmmaking about Northern Ireland. The very devices that make it effective are also what set it aside from mainstream representations. Its ambiguity perhaps alienates audiences who are accustomed to and expect linear narratives and match cutting, not silence, long takes, and abstraction. The period of violence in the late 20th century, known as the Northern Ireland Troubles, now exists as a tangled mass of stories. Generalised historical descriptions come from various points of view, including British, Irish and Northern Irish politics, the security forces, the prison service, the media, victims of violence and their families, and the perpetrators of violence across and within warring factions. Collective voices tend to overwhelm and discourage the singular, making it difficult for individuals to tell non-conforming personal stories. Contradictory voices also complicate the task of defining such a contested history in a concise yet informative manner for the purpose of contextualising artistic material that is responding directly to issues derived from that history. Now, just to pause for a second, because it hadn't come out before this, it was after. Certainly it was after the PhD research. The film 71, directed by Yann Demange, came out, and that film is precisely what I'm talking about here. It really exemplifies the chaos of what really went on. There are things that are official histories that just aren't true, and maybe people just know it within a community what really happened, but it's not what officially happened. And so there's all these contradictions in what the actual history was. As that film shows, there was a lot of maybe young ones were under order. They were making, a bomb or something in a pub or something, and they blew themselves up. And this probably happened a lot, but then this would be considered a win for the other side. So say loyalist paramilitaries were building a bomb and blew themselves up. The IRA would probably quite happily claim it, or the INLA or someone. They'd probably quite happily claim it because it was a win for them, because they thought, well, sure, that's a bunch of Protestants killed, so that's great for us. But the loyalist paramilitaries, probably the bosses, would maybe actually let people believe that that was the case because they needed to save face. They couldn't really put cause of death and competence on anything, So, and this probably vice versa, this probably happened because things were chaotic, certainly in the early 70s. And then they got better at making the stories and then making the official narratives. And things are very, very messy as to what actually really happened in a lot of cases. So that's the kind of thing I'm getting at. that, and that film hadn't come out yet when I was trying to explain that, but that's a really good point of reference if you're interested. 71 is a really good example of that chaos and that difficulty in really knowing what actually happened. So just to continue, what emerges in the study that follows is a series of intertwining tensions in histories across political, religious, social and gender divides and their visual representations. Writing in 2000, Martin McLuhan points out the failure of state-funded commercial films made about the Troubles during the 1990s to engage meaningfully with their immediate political context. Instead, they seem to recycle, quote, existing traditions of representing violence, offering only a variety of generic conventions from the thriller, the melodrama and the horror film to deliver banal humanist messages, unquote. McLuhan asserts that, quote, this cinema's relationship to the present is that it reminds us of the past and so underpins the necessity for continuing the search for peace. That this is the extent of its political sophistication is disappointing and only reinforces the feeling that cinema in general today, including Europe's state-subsidised national cinemas, has lost its ability or its potential for radical political and social analysis, unquote. This study presents an alternative way of thinking about cinema's potential for assessing Northern Ireland's post-conflict issues by broadening out the notion of what should be considered as cinematic. This approach is informed by considering the phenomenon of expanded cinema. At times in the study, I draw upon this movement as well as the film and visual art practices which exist on its periphery in an attempt to critically situate such practices in Northern Ireland. These are examined together with the four themes emerging from the post-agreement social psychology. As significant works are placed into this structure, convergences between modes of visual communication begin to emerge and become increasingly indistinguishable. For example, between live and non-live performance, various installation methods and experimental film. It is where the boundaries between moving image arts become indistinct that necessary radical political and social analysis is occurring. So I just want to make a point on this because something I don't really get into there is what was happening was when I started my PhD, it was actually more about cinema and it was supposed to be, I mangled it completely, it was supposed to be looking at film making north and south of the border in Ireland after the reinstatement of the Irish Film Board in 1993. So it was supposed to be basically 15 years of life with the Irish Film Board reinstated. So 1993 to 2008, and 2008 was when I started the PhD. It just meant that the north was very marginalised, and I just felt that the cinema that I was being asked to look at was already being covered extensively by the likes of Martin McLuhan and John Hill and people like Ruth Barton and all the big names, all the well-known names in Irish film studies. And I felt like I had nothing to add and that my PhD wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't do what a PhD is supposed to do, which is create new knowledge. I got a bit frustrated with all of that, and also, just to be quite frank, I'm not a reviewer, but to be quite frank, a lot of films are just terrible. I couldn't face watching a lot of them. They're really awful films because they're really low budget, and a lot of, I think, some of the best creatives, they don't get a chance. They just don't get a chance because they're in the working class areas and they are really marginalised. So it was those marginalised areas where people were struggling to actually have their voice heard. People were struggling to get funding. That was where the interesting stuff was happening. And so I started going to the art galleries and just seeing where people were doing interesting things. I was drawn to the topics that were coming through. What were the films about? What were the artworks about? And that was what I was getting really drawn to. So I ended up in that first year of my PhD totally changing its whole scope and what it was supposed to do, because it was the wrong question. It was a PhD that I had applied to do. I didn't come up with the project, but I rewrote the project and made a better one. So that other project, no one ever did it. Somebody probably still needs to do that. But I thought it was a really banal, boring question, and it was just getting answered anyway by the people who were already working on that stuff. And I just didn't really have any interest in it. But this I thought there was something in this: go to the marginalised areas, go to the people on the periphery, because that's where the stories are being told. That's where the interesting information is. And that's what I picked up on, because Martin McLoone was, full disclosure, he was my PhD examiner and one of the big names in Irish film studies. And so I used this challenge to, him pointing out, really bemoaning the fact that there wasn't really anything radical, no radical political and social analysis happening in Irish cinema. And I thought, well, it's not happening there, but it is happening. You just need to know where to look for it. And so if I stretch what this question could be, and if I go back to André Bazin's very fundamental question from the 1940s, what is cinema? And I rethink what is cinema, and I look at expanded cinema, and I look beyond the boundaries of what we think of as cinema. Are the answers going to be in those gaps, in those slippages, in those areas of convergence, in those areas of experimentation? So that's what I spent 3 years of my life doing, was looking for those. On we press. This is a very short one. This is about the shortest section. It's a paragraph, and it is contextualising the conflict, because that's the best possible way to sum up 30 years of torturous violence, is the bare minimum of factual details. And the best compliment I ever had was, there were very well established scholars from all kinds of areas that might be regarded as Irish studies in some way, and they would tell me, I read your thing and I can't tell what you are, meaning they couldn't tell if I was Protestant or Catholic, and so let's just keep it that way. That was good. I liked that. I liked erasing that part of my identity. Anyway, so contextualising the conflict. The consensus in critical writing concerning the Troubles, I don't like calling it that. I think I felt pressure to call it the Troubles continuously, because I prefer to say the Northern Ireland conflict or the conflicts, because I feel like the Troubles is really, because it's a very tabloid thing. I think it was journalists in the British journalists in the 1980s that were calling it that, and it just, you get people then saying, oh, it's the Bothers, or it's, oh, the Troubles, and it just belittles it. It belittles what happened, so I don't really like using it. So I'm not sure why I used it so much. I think maybe I was encouraged or felt that I had to, so that people would know what I was talking about, but I don't really like it, so just put that out there. The consensus in critical writing concerning the Troubles is that the conflict officially began in 1969 after months of upheaval stimulated by civil rights protests beginning in 1968 and the reaction of the British state to these protests. I cannot stress enough how tricky it is to put all this down in just a blunt, bare fact sort of way without giving an opinion on what you think happened. It's really a very difficult way of writing. The history leading up to this is long and complex, but since the partition of Ireland in 1921, Catholic nationalists in the newly formed region of Northern Ireland, and it didn't even have that name yet, increasingly felt economically excluded and socially marginalised. Inspired by civil rights demonstrations in the United States and the student protests across Europe, organisations such as the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association and the People's Democracy were formed of mainly, but not exclusively, and that's really important, not exclusively nationalist members in the 1960s. They marched in defiance of government bans, leading to violent encounters, violent encounters happened, let's say, with the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, the Ulster Special Constabulary, that's the B Specials, and Loyalist rioters. By 1969, increasing social disorder proved difficult to contain, so the government deployed the British Army, who were at first welcomed by nationalist communities for the protection they offered against loyalist gangs. And it's really fascinating this, because you can see loads of archival footage where the women in these neighbourhoods are bringing the soldiers tea and coffee and snacks and things, and about 6 months later it just all fell apart. The Provisional Irish Republican Army, the IRA, emerged as a counterweight to the growing presence of the traditional adversary, and the same people who had welcomed the British Army's arrival soon regarded the soldiers warily. A campaign of violence against the army escalated. Internment was introduced in 1971. So that's when people started to get imprisoned without any sort of trial and any sort of process. They were just thrown in jail for even just being suspected of doing anything, and that arguably is one of the biggest mistakes any government ever made on these islands. Until this year, probably, or the past few years. And the following year, the Westminster Parliament replaced the Northern Ireland government with direct rule due to its continued lack of control over the situation. This would remain until the emergence of the peace process in the 1990s. The negotiations that took place, which included paramilitary organisations, culminated in the 1998 Good Friday Belfast Agreement, which is about to be completely obliterated by the Tories in 2020. Although the ceasefires have lapsed and been reinstated, and dissident groups have maintained a violent presence, there has been relative peace since the late 1990s, and the establishment of a consociational government with devolved powers. It is the social change recognised during this post-agreement, post-conflict time, deriving from these histories, which informed this study of experimental film and visual culture. There's too much to get into there, and I'm so out of the loop now. More than murals. Because, this is a little in-joke to myself, this subtitle of More Than Murals. Every time I would go to a conference or a talk or something, and I would get chatting to people, and we would do the inevitable, well, what's your PhD about? What's your PhD about? And I would say what mine was about, and people would say, oh right, is that murals, is it? Every flipping time. Hence this little in-joke to myself, More Than Murals. My PhD thesis was full of stuff like that, just little in-jokes to myself for my sanity. It was late in the 20th century before Northern Ireland developed what might resemble the stirrings of a film industry. By the end of the 1990s, financial help from Britain, Europe and the Irish Republic aided the increase of feature films commissioned by the Northern Ireland Film Commission, which has since been rebranded as Northern Ireland Screen, which I'm sure those of you who watch Game of Thrones or things like The Fall or Line of Duty, you should know that symbol by now, the big green N. Martin McLuhan points out that the government at this time only saw merit in local film production for its potential as an industry to create jobs and generate knock-on economic benefits. John Hill notes that as far back in history as the partition, Northern Irish film was not regarded for any artistic value, but instead it was used to promote tourism, local goods and industry, as well as government propaganda. On this note, McLuhan draws attention to some Millennium films made on location in Northern Ireland that intended to address economic concerns. Wild About Harry, directed by, I don't even know, Lowney? Who was that? I don't even know who that is. That's terrible. And With or Without You, directed by Michael Winterbottom, so 1999, were supported financially by the UK Lottery and the Northern Ireland Film Commission. McLuhan explains they, quote, represent the optimistic peace process climate, unquote, but they can also be seen, quote, as examples of the shameful compromises that are now being demanded by the commercial imperatives that govern publicly funded films, unquote. He's not being behind the door there. One such imperative is to promote the shooting locations to potential tourists in order to gain economic return, meaning that the funding of films remain to be, quote, seen first and foremost as an economic rather than a cultural activity, unquote. So the message really is, it's all safe now, lads. Come on and have a wee visit, won't you? Give us all your lovely American dollars. The emphasis on these peace process spin-offs mean that professional filmmaking in Northern Ireland generally fails to become culturally distinctive or politically relevant. By the end of 2010, film production in Northern Ireland established a firm place and a good reputation in the global service industry. Production companies such as Universal and 20th Century Fox have made extensive use of the substantially sized Paint Hall studio in Belfast Titanic Quarter, as well as the surrounding rural landscapes for film and television productions such as City of Ember, directed by Gil Kennan in 2008, Your Highness 2011, and Game of Thrones, the HBO show that began in 2011. Meanwhile, Indigenous filmmaking receives little funding and struggles to find screening platforms. However, the recent critical and box office success of Good Vibrations films, and that was directed by Lisa Barrister and Glenn Leyburn in 2012, may herald the sea change. Do you know what? Unfortunately it didn't. They've done really well, but they only make a film every few years, but it hasn't really brought about that resurgence or that movement that I was really hoping it would. Given the economic focus on the service film industry, what is of relevance in this study are the cinematic qualities found in the culturally relevant, vibrant and often challenging film and visual arts subcultures which are pulsing through Northern Ireland's urban centres. It is in such work that the region's visual culture may be better understood, a visual culture shaped by the current post-conflict psychologies and anxieties that are clashing with and saturated by references from global popular culture. It is work which draws attention to these issues that is largely discussed in this text. In general, visual culture is divided between collective and individual circumstances, including where its collected elements are located and what histories have shaped their present. It can differ from person to person, place to place, and can be both specific and universal. The term's meaning differs on individual, collective, and academic levels and is continually in flux. The importance of studying how separate components of the visual accumulate as a broad type of culture lies in how visual experiences happen and the understanding that is gained from them. They are informed by the memories of past experiences, as well as extensive and varied sensory experiences that are encountered throughout life. Media clusters such as Expanded Cinema and Fluxus demonstrate this by engaging with a life-art technology relation, as well as the binaries of separation, connection, and the live, non-live. These are binaries which also resonate with a visual culture that is marked by the particular social changes experienced in Northern Ireland in the past half century. Clark's Elephant is one such marker. What is examined here then is a film and visual culture where sanitised conservatism clashes with the saturation of Western popular media and high art in a region whose citizens have witnessed decades of social conflict with their own eyes and through media representations in a double gaze that often seems to blur the real with simulations of the real. Each of the artists and filmmakers discussed in this book used their work to encourage alternative ways of looking at this history rather than accepting an image at face value. For example, Lockie Morris's Twist from 1989 is a sculptural piece that at once relates its form to the found object British style of sculpture widely practiced in the 1980s while alluding to a specific Troubles event, namely the mishandling of forensic evidence collected from a series of pub bombings for which the Birmingham Six were wrongly convicted. The piece consists of an old suitcase connoting travel or migration with rectangular sections cut from its sides. These rectangles are found in a playing card twist that props up the suitcase from which hangs a tag signed with the 6 names. All of this stands on a varnished plywood plinth in a play on the classic display of fine art sculptures. The twist is aesthetic, conceptual and integral to the men's convictions. The chemicals on their hands that led to their imprisonment came from the backs of playing cards and not from handling explosives. The twist is both literal in the sculpture and present in the implicit background story that can only be appreciated by viewers who are either privy to this past or willing to piece together the sculpture's clues. Morris's Twist shows how narratives can be found underneath surface images and indicates the capability of broader visual arts in Northern Ireland to coax viewers into revealing the truths that are lying underneath the protective masking of aesthetic and conceptual art forms. Right, we are on the last minute, so we'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much for being involved in whatever way. This has been Audiovisual Cultures. This has been a Cozy Pea Pod production with me, Paula Blair. When this is all edited together, the music will be Common Ground by Airtone, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution. If you want to support, I'm at buymeacoffee.com/PEA Blair, and you can give a donation or have a membership there, or you can do paypal.me/PEA Blair as a pay-as-you-feel donation if you can help. But your shares and likes and your engagements are all so important. Thank you so much for being here, and keep being excellent to each other. Just please be okay and look after each other. See you next time.